All right. Thank you for coming. Hopefully this will be useful to everyone here. This is a fairly controversial topic. And if it's not, I just read on Hacker News that pointless meetings are actually really a form of therapy, so it's a win-win. So partitioning the network stack. I am just the presenter. Most of the real work is done by the team. Shivani and Matt are in Cambridge here. And Yao, Cami, Eric, and Alex Turner have also been big contributors to the project. So when you look at the web today, what are the various ways in which we partition it, right? For security, for privacy. We have a few ways of doing it. So for cookies, the first thing we ever partitioned, it was etld+1 of the request URL. We have since had site isolation, where we isolate processes, render processes, and we do that by the etld+1 of the document. And similarly, we have isolated the code cache for V8 by the same etld+1 of the document. Same origin policy is origin of the request URL, right? That's XHR and fetch requests. And there's a whole lot of storage, especially, that we partition at the origin of the document. So that actually applies to same site cookies, as well as local storage, cache storage, service workers. I think permissions, I could be wrong on any of these, please correct me if I am, but the point is these are various ways in which we partition things on the web, but not the network stack. HTTP cache is completely shared by everybody. So is the DNS cache, the socket pools, server properties, etc. I'm going to mostly focus on the HTTP cache because that's what I know most about. I've done a lot of work on the cache in the past, and that's what this project started with. But there are folks on the team, and we are looking at actually splitting up like all the various parts of the network stack. But again, my focus will be on the disk cache. So why haven't we historically partitioned the cache? Well, performance, right? There are so many things on the web that we share that are cross-origin, right? Like so fonts and scripts and our connections, our H2 connections. There's tons of this stuff. This would be terrible if we were to do this. But there's downsides. For one, the cache can be used to store super cookies. You can have an individual identifier stored in the content of a cached resource, and then you can read it from a third-party context across the different sites you go to. And you can also use it for snooping. You can figure out what sites a user's been to. You can figure out what resources the user visited or loaded on those sites. You can load a cross-origin iframe and say, okay, what happened on that iframe? What was loaded? You can open up a new window and ask the same question. And there's proofs of concept in the wild that are showing people are actually doing this or can do it, in which you can determine what is in someone's mail by looking at whether the search result came up negative or empty or not. And if it was empty, then an image is loaded. And so you might ask, well, you can do this once, right? It's the cache. Once it's loaded into the cache, it's there forever. And you can't like ask the question twice. People keep finding clever ways to make that not the case. It's basically a CRUD API where you can just like read and write arbitrarily and determine if something is in the cache or not. This is unfortunate. So we have the security and privacy on one side and performance on the other. And how do we deal with this trade-off? Well, the first thing to do is to measure and say, well, how bad is it? What are the actual performance implications? And well, if we're going to measure, what is it we're actually going to partition the network stack by? etld+1 or origin? We've seen both on the web. I will dive into this a little bit. I much prefer origin personally. It's easy to think about, it's easy to describe. There's no public suffix list that needs to be maintained and downloaded. It's just always going to grow. It's not the most scalable thing. It would be nice if the web moved toward origin. But etld+1 is wider scope, less likely to cause as many performance issues. People also understand that fairly well. And frankly, Safari has set precedent here. Like 6 years ago, they actually split their cache and they used etld+1. So that's a big reason to use that as well. We've talked to them, we've talked to Mozilla, and they are both seemingly on board with switching to origin. So that's one thing. The next question is, what exactly do we want to isolate? Do we want to isolate pages from each other? Do we want to isolate just origins from each other? Kind of like a site isolation sort of idea, where imagine you just have two frames that are cross origin to each other on a page. Should they be able to introspect each other and know anything about the cache contents of each other? When I embed something on my page, should I have to trust that thing that I embed to not introspect me and snoop on me, and vice versa? So we have the question of, do we isolate just the pages from each other, or also the frames within the page from each other? So the way I talk about this is the top frame origin, or ETLD+1, is just the URL that you see like in the Omnibox in the URL bar. We are using that origin to separate and partition the cache. Or we're going to use that as well as the requesting document for a resource, which means the iframe. So either we're going to separate by top frame origin, or top frame origin and frame origin. I tend to refer to this as double keying, which is top frame origin, or triple keying, which is top frame origin as well as frame origin. So yeah, we did it. Let's just immediately go see, is this even tenable? How bad is it? So let me just present some of our first evidence. This is our first data. We keyed by top frame origin only. This is double key origin, not ETLD+1. We're just looking at the disk cache. This is just Chrome Android. And it's dev and canary data, so this is not beta or stable. It's smaller populations, but it's 28 days of data, which is fairly substantial, and measured as of yesterday, or sorry, the 11th. So what kind of impact might you think this has on network traffic? Like if we have, let's say, half of our network traffic, actually the number is 64% of our traffic that winds up going to the network stack does not go through the cache, but instead is served by the network. Any guesses on what the number might look like after we double key the cache? So we started at 64, we wound up at 65. And that's only, frankly, sometimes we see basically zero. It just depends on the 28-day window we're looking at. This is just, again, this is dev canary. We'll have better data when we're on stable and experiment, but this is a surprising result, right? You would expect there to be more than this of shared traffic. And so then you have to start to ask why, and we're digging into that. We don't know all the answers. A lot of it starts with the intuition of people are creatures of habit. They go to the same sites every day. They're not constantly exploring and seeing new stuff. That's unfortunate. We should all be exploring and seeing new stuff all the time, but this is the reality. So what about the rest of the metrics, like nav to first contentful paint, 1% regression. Nav to largest contentful paint, the new hotness, mostly 1 to 2%, but we are seeing at the 99th percentile a 3% regression. And what about specific types of resources like fonts or CSS or scripts, and specifically third-party fonts and CSS and scripts? We don't care about the first-party ones. Yeah, there's going to be impact on servers, right? They're going to be serving more fonts. They're going to be serving more script, and so we do have numbers on the cache hit rate, and it's dropped by 14% for fonts, especially. So what about triple keying? This is where we're isolating not just by the top frame, but also the frame of the iframe. Yeah.
Do you know if there's any data that Apple have shared when they?
I am unaware of any, but I haven't looked either, honestly.
Other questions? I know on the intent thread there was some talk about this might affect smaller sites more than larger sites, and I haven't followed the thread that closely. Was there any thoughts on that, or on that? You were saying question.
Yeah. So the question is, does this affect smaller sites more than larger sites, or do we have any data to suggest this is the case? I don't have anything that I can present here. We have done some preliminary exploration into that, and I don't believe the numbers have actually significantly changed. But I don't have like anything that I can like put weight behind today. So, all right, triple keying. Basically the same numbers. In this case, actually, the increase in network usage was near 0. Again, as I said, different 28 days and different experiments seem to show like we need more data to have more definitive numbers, but the point is that the trend is very good. It's basically no increase in network traffic. Again, like a 1% difference in first contentful paint, regression, I should say. And the third-party fonts, we went from like -14 to -16 hit rate. So what this doesn't show is that third-party frames, if you were to start partitioning by frame, then you're going to expect third-party frames to be affected more. And these measurements are like overall of the and mainframe measurements. Largest contentful paint actually includes subframes as well, but there are upcoming metrics that we're adding just to specifically look at third-party frames and see how they're affected. Now, this also impacts APIs, right? There's a lot of people in this room that care a lot about performance, the pre-star APIs in particular, as well as things like, hey, there's an upcoming talk later today about web shared libraries that Mozilla is putting forward and a lot of people are interested in, and portals, etc. How does this affect that? So just to give you an idea, like if you wanted to prefetch something that was cross-origin, well, it's going to go into the partition you're currently in and not into the origin that you're prefetching for. So when you then navigate to that origin, it's not going to be in your cache, right? So this is something that we need to think about. We're discussing ways this could be done. But when we have these discussions, we have to be cognizant of like, does it really make a difference? Do we have measurements to show that like this prefetching is worth it? There's a lot of complexity. It's a great way to shoot yourself in the foot if you don't do it well. So we want to look at the actual gains and weigh that against the implementation costs. And we also need to consider all the privacy and security implications of why we're doing this work in the first place. And is that creeping back into the picture if we're not careful? So as a recap, the trade-off so far is that things look pretty good in terms of overall, like we're not going to be costing the user a lot of new network data. The performance seems fine. So promising. We fully intend to go into beta and experiment there very soon, and like a 1% stable experiment, see how that goes, and hopefully launch at least double keying if all goes well. There is still work to be done before we can make that decision. We need to measure impact specifically on third-party frames. And this I've been talking about is the cache. There's a whole bunch of follow-up work to happen on socket pools, DNS, etc. We are very cognizant of fonts and the issues that can have for folks. So we want to like measure them in specific. And we need to keep talking about the impacted APIs and how we can mitigate that. So that's the end of my presentation aspect of it. There are links to an explainer and our intent to implement. And I would love to have just discussion in the room. Yeah, so let me switch to audience. And that didn't actually do anything. Do I need to?
It's switched. You can stop presenting if you want.
Oh, okay. No.
Tap, you have to tap.
Oh, there it is. All right. All right.
Camera controls if you want.
Where is it? Oh, it's at the window.
Yeah. Or don't worry, it's up to you.
All right, yeah, let's pass the mic.
So I missed the first 5 or 10 minutes, so this question might have been already asked, but similar to the smaller sites concern, so as far as I remember, the number for the experiments first had a dip, but then like gradually recovered, probably after like a cache had been filled for each partition. But I'm interested in like how the new sites, the sites user haven't been visited for a while, like the user will likely visit for the first time will be impacted So if you have any data,
We have a little bit of data on that. So how are new sites impacted? We have some metrics. It's hard to determine when is this a first visit to a site, but we have some notion of like, is this the first visit, or sorry, was this site visited from search? And if it was, how was the performance of that? And it's like 1 or 2% higher.
okay,
So
so
it's like there's like a 2% difference in first contentful paint. So we do see some evidence that, as you would expect, if it's your first visit, but that even coming from search is not a first visit.
okay.
We don't really measure in the browser, like, has, at least to my knowledge, has the user been here before? We could.
I'll pass on to you. Just one question, like you talked a little bit about double keying versus triple keying, and if I understand correctly, you're planning to go forward with the double keying. So can you say a little bit more about pros and cons of the two?
So I think the plan is to go forward with something. We haven't quite figured out which. There are still concerns about the number of like socket connections and whatnot if we go triple keying. If you have a bunch of frames that are all to the same or similar origins that could have shared the same H2 connection or quick connection, and now they don't. So we don't know the impact on that, and we would like to use the same key throughout the browser. So that's still to be determined.
So you showed the aggregate numbers for both script and fonts. We know that with script, people bundle heavily, so they ruin the caching effects by effectively doing that. For fonts, I'm a little surprised that the impact is almost comparable to script. We happen to have Google fonts. Did you talk to them and like analyze them in isolation to see if there's something like to it?
We are literally in the process of trying to find pages that have Google fonts and seeing how they in particular are impacted. We don't have enough data yet to actually say anything. I mean, the fonts folks have said, like, this is going to affect us materially in terms of more requests. And that is a concern for a lot of people. But in terms of performance, we don't have any data to suggest it's a problem, but we are still looking.
The pre stuff is broken as of right now, right? In the experiment, does search still do the no state pre-render? And if so, do you have the performance numbers for sites that were navigated to from search that were pre-rendered with and without?
Search does link that pre-render, but that's not affected by the double key cache because the navigation happens with the key of the destination right now.
Pre-render, but not prefetch. So
Prefetch.
Prefetch is broken, pre-render is not.
Correct.
There is a confusion. BlinkOn pre-render is backed by no state prefetch, which opens a renderer.
Right.
And fetches to the new thing.
And the prefetch is fetching sub-resources, and that's broken by this experiment. Yeah.
So
Yeah, sorry, but like from the past discussion, pre-render and prefetch would probably need to have same or similar like mechanism to be able to be done without privacy concerns. So
it's worth noting that all of that pre-star stuff is actually in these gross numbers. So it seems to be okay to not work, but that's my opinion.
Oh, but I don't know, like Tarian had some number that by running pre-render, we could reduce FCP.
The numbers that I have are for the pre-render, and that's not broken. Prefetch is, I think, has
That's
always,
the point, right? Pre-render is working.
pre-render is working, and the prefetch of sub-resources, I think, has not been working well from the search side.
Sorry, we have a performance number, right? So
That's what-
yeah, but right, but the pre-render is also like implemented as prefetch, and like prefetching as a pre-render for next navigation has a kind of not a kind of significant impact on FCP. So
I definitely think there are going to be individual sites that are affected by this, and we should try to come up with mitigations. If I think that they can be a little bit uncoupled from each other. Like I think we can. The numbers overall look good enough that we can kind of push this forward, and then I think we should be also thinking about how can we deal with pre-star, but not necessarily one blocking the other.
Do you know if the double keying persists into web views as well?
It is the same net stack. I'm going to let Matt. Do you know what how this works with WebView? You're muted, by the way.
Since this is all currently field trial driven, we don't have any WebView numbers. Since the field trials are only rolling out to, or actually, we aren't running the field trials in WebView, are we?
Shivani?
Yeah, I haven't seen explicitly like splitting by WebView and seeing the numbers, but as much as WebView has the field trial, I think we'll be impacting them. But I haven't seen the numbers explicitly.
So yeah, I think it actually might be in the experiment, and we can take a look. I've been
Yeah,
mostly
no,
focused on.
I'm not worried about current stuff. I'm just sort of worried about future critical resource prefetching stuff I was looking at that is going to basically be broken.
Blink also has its own cache, which is per render process and is not currently double keyed. So if you have something loaded using two different network isolation keys with the same site, we're probably cross-contaminating in Blink's cache.
Yeah, the Blink memory cache will also wind up being partitioned as part of this work.
Do you have an idea of memory impact?
So at last BlinkOn, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So at last BlinkOn, we talked about the Blink memory cache, but if I remember correctly, you were not concerned about the Blink memory cache because there are too many ways to leak things in renderer.
Because there's too many ways to
leak information in the render process.
I don't remember saying that. I am less concerned about it because it is a short-lived process, and so that memory cache will go away and has fewer chances to leak. But I would still think that we want to partition by it eventually.
I see. So the memory cache in Blink is partitioned by the document origin right now. So not partitioned by the top frame origin.
Okay. I think Eeyore was next, but
so we kind of focused on HTTP cache, partitioning HTTP cache here. Like, do you have any idea about what the progress is with regards to like other forms of storage?
So like what?
Cookies and all others like storage here.
So like local storage and all of that is already
Exactly.
split by origin.
Okay.
So the question, I guess, is third-party cookies, or yeah, unclear what's going on there. I think there's like all the browsers are talking about how to move forward on that, and we're just talking about like how. So imagine a world in which there were no third-party cookies. How would the rest of the browser look? Okay. But we don't actually know what's going to happen there.
Oh, sorry.
So I'll pass this to you next. This maybe is a naive question because you have 28 days of data. And I'm not sure if you wind up feathering out the more obscure cases or it's included. So, but my thought is that with the double key cache, it seems like you end up like eating more space and making more requests. And I wonder how that jives with the whole lowest end devices. Does that actually penalize low end devices substantially in some way?
That's a great question. It often turns out in the cache that it's fairly inefficiently used. And so we've done lots of experiments of just growing the size of the cache and seeing how that affects cache hit rate, and it basically doesn't. The diminishing returns are like immediate. So it just kind of turns out that there's a few resources that matter in the cache, most of them don't. And so this will just actually more effectively use the cache in a way, is my expectation. I mean, the hit rate's slower, but again, we're not actually using that much more network data. Suggesting that it's mostly small resources, I guess, that we're missing on.
I have actually two questions, one about memory and another about disk. The memory, will we have memory impact in memory cache in the renderer process after all of the changes? Not the current thing, but is it planned to increase there? And if we can help doing something in the infrastructure to deduplicate maybe read-only memory for that. Resources can be large.
That's a great question. So it sounds like we're already split in memory cache by document origin. So I don't think we're actually going to have that much more impact over that.
Okay. So another question is about disk. When working on disk cache, I noticed that a number of users hit the limits on the disk on Android. All the disks are full with pictures and other important content, and the cache is being washed out. And hence, it's not surprising that for these users, the number of network traffic is not growing. It would be interesting to look at these users in particular separately, but it's hard to say how that would work. Well, like doing that is not easy.
That's a good point. And it also suggests that maybe on Android, if that's a lot of users, because there is a lot of users that have full disk, I guess, of photos, then that would impact the overall metrics too. And it'd be worth looking at other platforms. Of course, all I presented was Android. Our desktop data is coming soon.
Just last note that it probably just correlates with low-end devices. And so it may be fine to look at just low-end devices.
That's a good point. Should do that.
So I wanted to ask about the other storage again. So like local storage is tied to an origin, but it's not double keyed today, correct?
I mean, it is double keyed in the sense that that origin's storage plus whatever name you give it is the other part of the key. But it's not part of the same isolation that we're talking about.
Okay, so are there any plans to have IndexedDB local storage like double or triple keyed? Like that seems like would have a big impact, and it wasn't clear to me. Like, are we actually looking at doing that?
It's certainly like on the table.
Okay.
So what third parties can do is unclear what the future looks like, but it's something people are talking about for sure.
So first I wanted to say congratulations. I got to admit, I was skeptical when this project started that it would ever get anywhere near close to the performance that we could launch without some major cost. So I was wrong. Awesome. Good work. That said, I'm still scared. We talked at CDS about how improving the caching of just 2% of the loads of ad scripts resulted in 0.5% more revenue for every publisher in the world that uses Google Ads. That seems like a pretty significant increase in the GDP of the web to me. Is that a metric that you're looking at so that we can, like, I'm not sure how to reason about, percentage of cache hit rate or whatnot in absolution, but like how much money the entire online news industry makes is a useful number to me. Is that a number that you're taking into account? I mean, I know there's no numbers you can share here, but is that a way of looking at the data you're taking into account when thinking about the trade-off here?
Yes.
Good, thanks.
So I've been reading a little bit about Apple's intelligent tracking prevention feature. One thing they do is what they call the verified partition cache. So they have their cache partitioned by ETLA+1, as you mentioned. And additionally, they will sometimes check to see, in the case of redirects, if the location header is the same. Is this something that has ever come up in your efforts?
No, not yet. I actually don't know all that much about it. Be curious to hear more.
Okay, we can talk after.
I don't know if this is already asked, so apologize if it was, but has there been any talk about deduplicating resources that have been duplicated?
Sure. We don't have a lot of evidence, like, so just from history of the cache, we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that that would actually do a ton of good. So I can give you some anecdata here. Chrome has what's called a cache tool. You can build this as a target, and then you can run and see one of the options is like, it's called list, or it's called dupes is the command. And it will show you, it'll MD5 sum everything in your cache and then show you how much of it is duplicate, right? So the idea is if everyone's using jQuery, then there should be like 500 duplicate versions of jQuery in your cache. And the answer is there's not. Everyone uses their own version of jQuery. That makes sense. And so when you run it on your own anecdotal, like on your own cache, what you'll see is about 60% of the requests in your cache actually are duplicate, but they're like tracking pixels, which are cached for unknown reasons. And they take up like 1% of your disk space. So the actual amount of duplicate is in the low percentages. Now it's going to depend on who you are and what you currently have in your cache. Videos can suddenly eat up all of your cache. And then like, so if you had 2 of the same video, then that would change the numbers. But from what I've seen anecdotally, there isn't a lot of cause to worry about deduplication in the cache.
That's true even after you double or triple key? Like I would have expected like...
You would assume more, yeah. That's a good question. I have not actually rerun that experiment since, and we should.
A year ago, I looked at my own cache. A year ago, I looked at my own cache on desktop in order to find duplicate resources. And as you say, there are none except tracking pixels. And one other exception that I think is notable is multi-profile and extensions. In each profile, extension has the same content and it's being duplicated.
Yeah.
But for Android, it doesn't matter.
And we try to keep them separate for profiles, like I think in different disk spaces anyway. I mean, we could talk about that, but that's probably a good thing that they're partitioned by folder. I don't know, not keeping track of time. Looks like we're a little over. So another question, or should we wrap it up? All right. Oh.
I'll ask that.
Cool. Thank you.